Like many of the people in this room, I'm sure, I've traveled all over the world, and I've done that really since I was a little child, about 3 years old. And the one thing that I've noticed is that everywhere I go, people are always looking for something. It really doesn't matter who they are. And they're looking for many, many, many different things in different aspects of their life. So for some people, they're looking for money. Others are looking for relationship, kids and family, a certain lifestyle that they think will make them happy or make them fulfilled, which often brings with it a lot of different material decisions in terms of how they live their life. Just about everyone in my world says they're constantly looking for more time, myself included, I have to confess. Well, I want to ask all of you something this morning, and that is, what are you looking for? What is each and every one of you looking for? What are you looking for out of this presentation? What are you looking for out of TED? What are you looking for later tonight, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year? What are you looking for out of your parents, out of your kids, out of your spouse, out of your coworkers, out of your employer? What are you looking for? Now, the amazing thing is that you can all answer that question. And when I say to you, what are you looking for out of your spouse? Or what are you looking for out of your employer? Something immediately comes to mind, right? This isn't something that you've never thought about before. This is something that you think about all the time. And in fact, your mind is constantly working, trying to figure out what it is that you want next. Even right now, even out of this presentation. It's a very simple reason for that. And that is something we don't talk about very much at all in society. But the reality is that all of us feel like we have a hole inside of us that we're trying to fill. And that next thing that we're looking for, whether it's in this presentation or a year from now, is something that we think in some way will help to fill that hole that we all know is deep down inside us. And we've tried many, many different things. And our minds are constantly trying to tell us what it is that will actually fill that hole. And it does a very good job of convincing us that if we can only find the key, that hole will be filled. And it does a very good job of convincing us that the key is, in fact, something that we can achieve tomorrow. Or something that we can achieve a year from now. Something involving our kids, or our spouse, or our career, or whatever. But the reality is, it's always fuzzy, right? Just like this guy that's up here on this diagram. It's blurry. It's fuzzy. The mind wants us to believe that it's very, very specific. But every time that we achieve something, it turns out it didn't fill the hole. Every time we get the key that we think we need to fill that hole, it doesn't do it for some reason. And so the picture stays fuzzy. And the mind keeps trying to work on it more and more and more. The more successful you are, the more you may begin to wonder, is this even possible? Is it even possible to fill that hole that is deep down inside you? Well, to me, this seemed like one of the most fundamental research questions that were out there. You know, what faces humanity more than this? What guides humanity more than this? What affects all of our lives in every moment of the day more than this? And so I began a quest to try to figure out if there was anybody out there that had really successfully filled this hole, that actually believed that they no longer had the experience of that hole that all of the rest of us have. And it's not impossible. I can tell you, in fact, that I've talked to hundreds of these people with very in-depth research that ranged from standard psychological assessments to in-depth interviews to neuroscience with fMRI scans and EEG and things like that. So we've been doing very exhaustive research on this population of the hundreds of people that we interface with, but I know for a fact that there are many more thousands of people like this just in our databases that we'll never have time to get to. Now, there's only so much time that you have when it takes a day to interview someone. There's only so much time that you have when it costs you thousands of dollars to do an fMRI scan and takes several hours to get someone in and out of the machine. There's limits on all of this. Let me tell you what we've learned over the last several years of looking into these people. You're probably sitting out there wondering, well, who are these people? What makes them special? What gives them what the rest of us want, what we spend every day trying to figure out in our minds? And if you look back at these people, right, they're pretty normal looking. The reality is that they're normal looking because they are in fact very normal. When you give them psychological assessments, it turns out that the only thing that's different about them is that they're a lot happier, that they don't have depression and anxiety. But that's it. They score normally on all of the other psychological tests that we give them. And yet, somehow they've found a way, right, to have that hole filled in them. They are across the entire population. Our youngest subjects start in their teens. We don't go into kids just for research, sort of legal reasons. They go all the way into their 90s. They cut across every socioeconomic group. There's incredibly rich and powerful people. There's incredibly poor and powerless people in this population, everything in between. There's people who dropped out of the lowest schooling imaginable. There's people who have PhDs. They are literally a cross-section of the entire population. In other words, there doesn't seem to be any reason that everyone out here can't do the same thing that they've done, which is find the key and fill that hole. But interestingly, when you talk to these people, when you ask them, hey, what is it that did that for you? They don't know. They can't tell you. They're very, very unsuccessful at helping other people get to that same place of deep inner fulfillment and peace that they've arrived at themselves, which is why it takes so much work on our part as researchers to try to figure this out. Let me share our findings to this point. We're 5 or 6 years into this at this point. And everything that we've learned can be represented in a very simple graph. Now, this is actually a continuum. You can think of it as a developmental continuum. So if you're all the way on the right side of this continuum, that's where most of the population tests. That's where most of the population turns out to be. And if you're all the way on the left side of this continuum, you're a very, very, very rare person that we're always trying to find more of to conduct our research and experiments on. On this far right side of the continuum, these are the people who are fulfilled. So you can see that the continuum is divided into 4 things separated by dashed lines. The last 2 are those people that have that deep inner sense of fulfillment. Now, it might surprise you, right? Why isn't there just one tiny little sliver for those people? Isn't this a binary state? Doesn't a switch just flip inside them and suddenly they have that deep inner fulfillment? Well, yes and no. Yes, that does happen, but then there's a settling in process, there's a growth process, there's a development process that they go through just like all the rest of us go through. Now, this is actually less relevant, I'm assuming, to those of you who are in this room today. So we're going to talk more about the other half of this continuum, because this is where all of you, or at least most of you, I'm assuming, are. This is where most of the population resides, in these first 2 quadrants of the model. So let's just talk very briefly, because these are short presentations for TED, so we don't have a lot of time to get into this, but let's just talk very briefly about these couple of quadrants. First of all, if you're way over there on the far left side, you can notice right away that you're as far as you can be from that place of filling that hole. So that's not really where you want to be. That's not really where you want to be living your life from, right? What's it like to live from there? You are deeply embedded in the stories that you tell yourself about the world. You are deeply embedded in the way your mind wants you to believe the world operates. And you really don't have any distance from that at all. So in effect, your sense of self, what's referred to up here as the symbolic sense of self, is bound up in all of the stories that your mind is telling you about both yourself and the world in general. And for those of you that are there, which is probably many of the people in this room, and certainly everybody has at least passed through there, you know that that is not the most pleasant place to be, because our minds get stuff wrong, right? It gets stuff wrong all the time. It tells us the next key is the thing you need to produce that fulfillment, and then we do everything possible to try to get that key, and when we achieve it, it turns out, still have the hole. The second quadrant has been researched quite extensively for about the last 10 years, ever since a leadership change in the major psychology research organization, the American Psychological Association, in 2000, when a new president came in, and he said, we're going to start spending money figuring out what makes people happy, instead of figuring out how to cure a small number of people with schizophrenia or a small number of people with other various psychological conditions, which is what mostly had happened in psychology up to that point in time. So for the last 10 years, a tiny, but much more than ever before, trickle of money has flowed into research that has helped us to figure out how people can get happier. Now the key is that it's figured out how we can get happier within the context of those stories that our mind tells us. And what it's learned mostly is that the distance that we get from those stories equals greater well-being, equals greater happiness, equals a better quality of life. So there's been all these different methods that have been researched about how to get distance from those stories that are in our minds. And if you've done any of that type of work from a psychological standpoint, or you've done any of that type of work from a self-help standpoint, or maybe just as a function of being religious, you've done a lot of contemplative prayer, or you've done a lot of meditation, or you've done a lot of spiritual practices that are designed to induce this, you may find yourself in that second quadrant, which is, notice, a lot closer to the optimal quadrants, which are at the end. So what happens when you make it across that second dashed line? What happens when you make it into that territory that is really maximum well-being? When you fill that hole that we're all trying to fill? Well, the short answer is you really stop seeking things. Now, you might have this picture in your mind, well, wait a minute, if I stop seeking things, does that mean that I just don't do anything with my life from that point on? I mean, do I go and just basically sit at home on the couch and do nothing because I'm just content and I don't need anything else? No, you don't. It turns out you're a very, very high-functioning individual at this point. So if you were running a company, and many of them do run companies, your performance before and after that transition is a marked difference. And in fact, neither you, nor your shareholders, nor the people that you work with would ever want you to go back to who you were before, because you're delivering much more than you were really capable of delivering previously. Notice that as you move along, something must change, right? For there to be a third quadrant and a fourth quadrant, it implies that this is not simply an on or off. Well, it is an on or off in some sense. There's a transition of your sense of self so that you feel more complete. You don't really feel a need for anything outside of you to be sought after, to come in, to complete you, and to make you happier. You're pretty much just good being who you are. Who you are is fine. You don't need a new car. You don't need a certain kind of car. You don't need a spouse necessarily. You don't need a certain type of spouse. You know, we would all prefer it if our kids don't drive us crazy or the people in our lives don't annoy us, right? But generally speaking, you're not out there seeking after these types of things that the vast majority of the rest of the population is out there constantly trying to get at, constantly trying to attain. And as you deepen in this, that deepens for you as well. So when you first start out, you still have some of these types of desires, but they're only around things that were incredibly emotionally charged for you prior to your transition. And as you move along from the third to the fourth quadrant, those fade, and they no longer really deeply affect you like they once did. Right? So again, you're continually getting distance from the stories in your mind. And there's a dissolving, basically, of the emotional power of those stories to just grab hold of you and rack you and create a desire in you to take action that may be less than optimal, or to keep you being less happy and fulfilled and finding the meaning in your life and in the world that is otherwise possible. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so let me just give you 2 big tips. The thing that you need to understand about this continuum is that you're on it somewhere. Everyone in this room is somewhere on this diagram. Now, tip number 1 is that where you are on this diagram relates to very specific techniques that you can use to get distance from those stories. Tip number 2 is that if you use the wrong technique, very often what happens is that either no change for the better occurs, or worse things begin to happen to you. You embed deeper in the story, literally just things seem worse than they seemed before. So if you've ever gone out and gotten a self-help book, and in that self-help book, like many of them do, they say, this technique is good for everyone. Well, in fact, my team has researched tons of self-help techniques with groups of people, and we have yet to find a single one that is good for any more than a small sliver of the population at any given time. So it depends where you're at, and where you're at has to match to a specific technique. Now you might be saying, well, okay, but you've got a minute left. How can you possibly tell us where I'm at on this continuum? And of course I can't do that. But here's what I can do for you. I can tell you that in research what we learned is that if you try a technique for 2 weeks, you should see results if it matches where you're at on the continuum. Sometimes you'll see negative results. The minute you start seeing negative results, let it go. Drop it right away. It's not going to turn around. It's not what the self-help author or whoever is telling you, oh, well, you just need to go through a little something, you need to practice a little more. No. Stop doing it right away. Right? If after 2 weeks it's going great for you, keep doing it. In fact, keep doing it until it stops working for you, whatever that technique is. Because when it stops working for you, that simply means that you've probably moved ahead on the continuum, and you need to experiment around a little bit and find the next technique that will work for you for a while, and then move you to the next place. Thank you very much.